Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Underscored, a podcast from Young Voices. I'm your host, Stephen Kent. It is February 28th, and we are back to talk about a pretty tough subject, that of racial reparations for slavery. It has become a flashpoint in the 2020 campaign among many prominent Democrats running. I would really say almost all of them have engaged with it at some level, entertained the idea of committees on the issue and exploring it if they were to be president. It's always been sort of in the fringes or the outlying aspects of Democratic politics, and we're really seeing it take center stage in profiles in the Washington Post, Fox, the New York Times, just in the past week. So I wanted to have a conversation about it and engage with the idea a little bit in good faith and really talk about the merits of the idea, where it might have issues and where it might have promise. So I have a conversation all recorded for you that we'll cut to right now. So House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California waded into historically fraught political waters on Wednesday when she announced she supports forming a commission that would explore the possibility of paying reparations to Black Americans as a form of restitution for slavery. Just a week before, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders was asked whether he endorsed reparations for descendants of slaves in the U.S. It was in a CNN town hall, and he responded with another question. What does that mean? Indeed, Bernie Sanders. Indeed. Joining me today to talk about this and try to, put a finer point on what that means, the sudden rise of reparations in 2020 for Democrats. I'm joined by Christian Watson and Jerrod Laber of Young Voices. Welcome to both of you. Jerrod, I want to start with you because you've expressed support for this concept, where Christian is, I think, a little bit more reticent. And so can you lead us off with why you support it and, in short, how you sort of came to this viewpoint?
Sure, yeah. So I believe that the federal government owes African Americans and even other groups such as Native Americans reparations for historical injustices because the evidence is pretty clear, I believe, that we can tie sort of existing social inequality, but economic, social, and economic inequality. We can tie these things back to explicit policies on the part of the federal government. A lot of the focus is on slavery, which actually I find as sort of a less compelling argument for reparations. Obviously, slavery was a huge, sort of morally repugnant institution that plagued the entire world, but particularly the Western world for far too
Original
long.
sin.
Yeah, but I am more convinced by what Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in 2014, in which he wrote his famous article for The Atlantic, the case for reparations, and he did not ground it in slavery or even the early years of Jim Crow and American Reconstruction, but instead in housing discrimination, redlining. Redlining was a practice during the New Deal. It started during the New Deal, in which the federal government basically systematically made it very hard and prevented African Americans from owning homes. And anyone who and while at the same time, readily subsidizing the homes of white Americans. And that home ownership has been, historically in America, home ownership has been sort of the main way that families, middle class families, gain wealth and are able to pass that wealth on to their subsequent generations. And that was a privilege that was denied to one group while subsidized and encouraged for another group. And I think you can tie a lot. I think you can tie a lot of the sort of the economic inequality we had, the racial wealth gap today, to that decision to deny home ownership to African Americans.
I think that's definitely more close in the rearview mirror, and we can sort of see those tangible effects still playing out. Wealth has a huge part to do with this. Now, Christian, you've stated that the move toward reparations in the 2020 primary is something of a rush to attracting minority voters. I think we can all agree that the Democrats are known for this, but it's notable how much of an escalation this idea is for the party, and it kind of came out of nowhere. What's going on here in your approximation?
Oh yeah, so I think we have to see the leftward shift the Democratic Party has made over the past few years. Particularly, it's been solidified by the Sanders campaign. Because when Sanders dropped out in agreement with Hillary, he decided that he would put a lot of his ideology into the platform, and we've kind of seen the very very far left, like people on the Me Too movement, the woke skulls. They have kind of just taken that and they've used it as a catalyst for their ideas. I think that's what we're seeing here. I know it's very interesting that Barack Obama, even who's a black man himself, and even when he was president, didn't really take seriously the idea of reparations on the basis that like how what does that look like basically to put it in Senator Sanders' words. I think that's a very valid criticism because a historical injustice, right, is very hard to solve for because injustice or justice are individual things, right? So I can be just to a person or unjust to a person. But when you take justice from the individual person and you extrapolate it to a very, very, very large level, it becomes very hard to actually solve for anything, to actually give reparations in general to anyone. And I think that's probably the biggest issue. But politically, I think that minority voters are kind of scared by Trump. And there is a lot of hysteria around the Trump administration because he has had people like Stephen Bannon and Stephen Miller who
Yeah.
are xenophobes and arguably racist. I wouldn't go that far. Arguably racist. They've said some pretty nasty things, and so they're kind of painting themselves as saviors in a sense. And I think that's what the next election is going to deteriorate to. It's going to be I think it's going to be like Harris or another woman or a black person against a supposed bigot, and the question will be, whereas President Trump said to minority voters, "What do you have to lose?" They will say, "Who was fighting for your best interest?" And so reparations is like a locus to achieving that end, I think.
Yeah. Real quick, just kind of putting a pause here. If anybody on the line is kind of like shuffling around or whatever in their seat, or like their microphone is dangling, it's kind of creating like a lot of sounds like rough kind of sound, like it might be rubbing up against your shirt or something. So if you can try to everyone sit still or mute your line if you're not talking, that'd be great. Um, but Jerrod, what do you make of what Christian just laid out there in terms of the political maneuvering and sort of how we got here in the conversation? Because again, like I said earlier, it does sort of seem like this came out of nowhere, and I'm not really even sure who started the conversation, but all the Democrats are sort of now using it as a litmus test.
Yeah, no, I think he's basically right. It seems so. Reparations has always been a big thing for members of the sort of the further reaches of the progressive movement. The far left, as people like to call it. And now you're seeing that more ascendant on the national stage. You have representatives like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and others who openly use the term socialist to describe their political philosophy. So you're seeing this ascendancy of sort of far left progressive politics, which I think and that has been in part a reaction to the excesses of the Trump administration. So reparations has always been there, but now that basically the Overton window of sorts has shifted, and it's shifted on social policy. It's particularly shifted to the left on social issues in the wake of the Trump administration, particularly on issues of particularly when it comes to things like immigration, and just the sort of general posture of the Trump administration towards race relations has caused a lot of voters to shift to the left, and that's why you see the success of people like Ocasio Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Julia Salazar in New York State, who's now openly calling for New York State to decriminalize sex work. So you're sort of seeing an ascendancy of sort of further to the left progressive values, I think, across the board.
So slavery and Jim Crow were state-run atrocities. I get that, and I don't like state power run amok. The Great Society was in some ways aimed at addressing this, but there's no question it really has not been successful. And some would say that that is by design. How would a second pass at leveling the playing field for Black Americans be different from have gone on in the past, because I'm pretty sympathetic to Christians' more cynical view that this is just political posturing and sort of like a new level of trying to just get all minorities behind the Democratic candidates against Trump, and that there's not much sincerity there. But I also read The Case for Reparations. I'm very familiar with the racial wealth gap issue, and I'm pretty darn sympathetic to that as well. To Jerrod's point, so kind of engaging with the idea a little bit in good faith. What would a second look at this actually look like if we tried to do something like reparations?
Well, I think so. I think you sort of hit at it in your remarks. The emphasis over the years has always been on sort of income inequality, whereas income and wealth are different things. You earn your income from your job, but wealth is something much greater. Is something that you obtain over time and you're able to pass down. And I think the focus, at least on on the sort of the very hardcore, very motivated proponents of reparations, are now beginning to focus on wealth as opposed to simply just like income inequality. And so you see that with like Elizabeth Warren, who who proposes a wealth tax. Economists like Sandy Darity at Duke and Derek Hamilton, I believe, who's at Ohio State, they've come up with this idea of like baby bonds, which I don't fully understand the ins and outs of it because I'm not an economist. But this idea of baby bonds, that every American would have basically a Treasury sponsored bond waiting for them when they turn a certain age, so that they have wealth. So that way, when they're an adult and they're entering the labor market, they're entering adulthood, they have wealth that basically can springboard them
Yeah,
into
and
adulthood.
those bonds would sort of exist on a sliding scale based on family income. And so I think the Cory Booker view is that it would naturally target itself towards Black Americans who, by and large, possess less wealth overall than white Americans, and you sort of see a natural balancing out. I have some technocratic bones in my body, and I'm sort of warm to the idea. But I guess what I get tripped up here on, and Christian, I'd love to see what you think about this, is, you know,
Yeah.
Jerrod has mentioned that, um, you know, it was sort of, state violence, state monstrosity, and that the state should be put on the hook for this. But isn't that just the American public on the hook in the form of the taxpayer? Because that's how it will be
hmm
framed inevitably. When we talk about the government, we tend to talk about the taxpayer who's actually paying for
Yeah.
it. What do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, and so I think the entire problem with having the state try to redress for its ills is that the people that were in the state 50 or 60 years ago that put in these atrocious policies that institutionally kicked blacks out of higher wealth communities or so on and so forth are not the people that are in the state right now. I think that's quite obvious, actually. We see, I mean, so you would have to somehow go back in time somehow, and if you want real justice, and convict or make people who are in the state then pay for it. And most people who are in this state then are either dead or they're old, and really they probably don't have very much money. But I think overall, though, the state did, while it did inflict Jim Crow and slavery, it also tried to redress for those ills with the Fair Housing Act 1968 and the Community Reinvestment Act, which explicitly about redlining, explicitly outlawed redlining. And so what happened after that is that black folks were like, okay, let's go buy houses, but the equity value in the houses were too high because they had been and didn't have enough wealth to acquire them. So I think that a lot of it is certainly circumstantial as well. So a solution to this is, I'm not sure that entirely is one. The only solution I can see is, instead of relying on the state to redress ills that it inflicted upon you, I think self reliance and personal responsibility. Because we have to ask ourselves, are there any material barriers in the way of African Americans today beyond the redlining thing, which I think is entirely very circumstantial. And I'm not entirely sure that mortgage companies are colluding with each other to deny African Americans loans. It makes no sense to me. I understand that it seems very suspect that whites are offered loans, particularly like places like Philadelphia, at a much higher rate than blacks are. But I also think it's very suspect that when we control for every other factor, credit score is not controlled for. And I don't necessarily think that mortgage companies have an incentive to deny someone a loan on the basis of their skin color because they lose money that way. It's a profit motive.
So,
So I yeah, yeah,
oh yeah, no, thank you. I
uh,
appreciate that view a lot. And
Yeah.
what I wanted to round out on was sort of the issue of like the spiritual and I don't know, wound on the country. And this has been
Yeah.
said a whole lot by a Democratic kind of I don't know, not fringe candidate. What would be the word? Wild card candidate Marianne Williamson. She was a formal spiritual advisor to Oprah, and she's been running on the
Yeah.
reparations issue for 2020 and really talking about it as a spiritual wound that we have not healed. And it sort of brings to mind apartheid South Africa. And
Hmm.
I hear a lot about, and I'm not an expert on this issue, but I hear a lot about how that society and that government um, made very specific government apologies and redresses for those wrongdoings, and that by and large has been helpful. We're sort of seeing drama appear in South Africa again now, but it's
Hmm.
always been trumpeted as a more positive model of how to address past racial grievances. Do you think, Jerrod and Christian, that we just simply have lacked a formal government apology that was substantive?
Um, I don't necessarily think so, because a lot of people in the black community, speaking as a black man, still view the state as a enemy to them, and I think that there's some basis for that because the police brutality is outrageous, and there are a bunch of other things. But I don't think that hearing the state apologize, especially under the Trump administration, would do very much of anything. They would probably just see it as grandstanding. They want something material. They want something that they can use to feed their families or to get out of poverty. And that sentiment is completely understandable. What I think needs to be instilled to actively combat the past wounds inflicted by state violence is just a emphasis on personal and individual perseverance. And so many black folks like Ben Carson or Scott of South Carolina, so many have raised out of that system of poverty into a system of middle classhood or wealth where they can actually feed their families and break the generational cycle of it. So I think that is what we need to emphasize upon most if we're going to actually solve this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there has been maybe not so much it has anything to do with a lack of apology on the part of the federal government, but I definitely think that there, in white America, I'm from Appalachia, which is basically as white America as you can get. I feel like there has been this sort of collective inability to really grapple with the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, housing discrimination, the whole nine. I feel like it's an issue that's not talked about very much. It's an issue that people don't think about very much. So that they don't think about structures and how and institutions and how those things change over time or how they don't change, and how even if you change the laws that necessarily you're still not necessarily going to get good outcomes. So even yes, the redlining was outlawed in the late 70s, but we still don't see very good outcomes in terms of housing policy, particularly. And that has that's a very complicated issue as well. Has a lot to do with zoning and sort of local regulations in housing as well that have disparate sort of racial outcomes. I think there has been maybe I don't know if it's an unwillingness, maybe it is an unwillingness, but there hasn't been, I think, a reckoning in white America with the sort of the very pernicious legacy of a lot of these these discriminatory policies.
I'm not entirely sure why there should necessarily be a reckoning in white America, because really, I think again this issue has to do with all of us as individuals. I think that if we really want to beat back this evil, grotesque legacy of Jim Crow or all these other racially institutionally racist laws, it has to start within the black family. It has to start within us. I don't think anyone else needs to be necessarily involved in it, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I would just say I would say sort of humans are social animals, and like when I say necessarily they need to come to terms with it or reckon with it, it's just understanding that things, that history played out as it did for a reason. Like, I'm from a primarily white community, and all of my neighbors growing up were white, and that in a lot of cities and around the country, particularly in larger cities where like I live in Washington D.C. now, like
Yeah.
that sort of thing happened for a reason, like for a very specific reason, and it was largely white homeowners wanted to keep people of color out of their neighborhoods. And I think just sort of a recognition that that history exists and you still live with the legacy of that, I think would go a long way in this regard.
All right, that does it for this week's episode of the Underscored podcast from Young Voices. I have been your host, Stephen Kent. I hope you enjoyed this. I was looking forward very much to having this conversation and engaging with this idea. You know, my opinion has been changing a lot on this issue over the past couple of years, and I think that's what this podcast is all about, is just to give you sort of a menu of options and different ways to engage on the ideas that are dominating the news and political debate and the upcoming campaign. So, again, thank you to Jerrod Laber and Christian Watson for joining for this conversation. You can follow them both on Twitter. Their handles are in the show notes, and you can find Young Voices at YVADV and myself at Stephen_Kent89. Thank you again for listening to Underscored. We'll be back next week with more, and until then, stay free.